Hello and welcome to episode 14 of the BitLemmas Podcast. I'm Watson. I'm here with B Sovereign and possibly Josh. We'll see if he joins in. Today is a book review of The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Wengrow. So, what's the point of The Dawn of Everything? It's not who was right in 9000 BC. The point is political imagination. What story do we tell ourselves about what human beings can do on purpose? The standard story says humans started in small egalitarian bands. Then agriculture created surplus and property. Then cities created bureaucracy and states. And hierarchy became unavoidable when you're thinking about scale. The book attacks that story. It argues that human history is not a one way ladder. People have repeatedly invented, abandoned, mixed, and redesigned political forms. In the next half hour, we'll review four counterintuitive truths. Number one, pre agricultural life is not just tiny egalitarian bands. Number two, agriculture and cities did not automatically create hierarchy. And number three, the state is not one thing. Domination has components. And number four, freedom is practical. The ability to move, disobey, and create new relations are all part of freedom. The builder question is simple. If hierarchy is not destiny, what institutions should we design differently? Now, what is this book? It's a new big picture of human history, going from prehistory into what the author defines as states. We're going to have a very specific definition of state. The core move is the standard origin story that we're all taught is wrong. But more importantly, it's politically limiting. And we're going to go into that extensively. What does the author use as a method? Archaeology and anthropology. Graeber is an anthropologist. Wengrow is the archaeologist. And they're going to widen the option space, what it is that humans historically have done when they're reasoning about social arrangements. What's the goal? It's to recover political imagination. What is that? It's what humans can do when, on purpose when they contemplate how their social arrangements should be. What's the standard story? What the authors think of as a trap. Once upon a time, there were small bands and they were egalitarian because they were small. Then you had agriculture, which developed a surplus. You could imagine farmers farming, creating, or farming corn. And then they have extra, it's a surplus. And then they develop some idea of property. That extra is mine, that extra corn is mine. Some people are better than others at creating property. And so now you have inequality. Then you have cities. Then you have complexity within the cities, their social arrangements. You have bureaucracy, which the author looks at as some type of recording. And then you have a state, so some type of enforcement, violence upon the rules. This is kind of what people have some type of intuition of the evolution of social arrangements. And the moral of the story is hierarchy is the price of scale. As you get more humans dealing with each other, then you're going to have some type of hierarchy. You're going to have some leader that tells you what to do. And there's no alternative. This is a standard story.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to bring forth that this is the myth that we really all internalize. It's the Hobbesian story that life without a king is solitary, it's poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's the story. It's the story that tells us that to have scale, we must sacrifice freedom. So this narrative is the ultimate justification that every centralized system uses, and they do it really well. And they claim that it is to protect us. So the book's goal, I mean, of course, here is to recover our political imagination. So I do want us to keep that in mind and to show us what humans have already done, and really reinstating that we can do it again. So, for those that are unfamiliar with Thomas Hobbes, he was a philosopher that believed humans should live in peace under a sovereign power, so as to avoid conflict with the state's nature, uh, and the state's nature, which is essentially life before we formed civil societies. But we will touch on that uh, in a couple of slides.
Right. So now the thesis of the book. Human history is not a one-way ladder, kind of like what we just went over as far as these progressions. Early societies experimented with many political forms. I'll talk about a couple of different ones in the coming slides. Cities and complexity don't automatically require kings and bureaucracy. I find this to be very counterintuitive when talking amongst friends. You have cities that didn't have kings. And then loss, our loss, when we adopt this view, is not equality, it's the freedom to reconfigure. What do we mean? It's our belief that you can have some type of institution without hierarchy. That's what you lose when you don't have the story, the history of humans doing that repeatedly over and over. So we're going to dump into all that. So major premises of the book. Rousseau, that's Jacques Rousseau, and Thomas Hobbes, the author, is saying that this is an unhelpful false choice. Now, this is a big claim because these are two titans within political philosophy. Thomas Hobbes, like what B. Sovereign was saying, the Hobbesian view is that there's a couple concepts. You have the state of nature, which is what he calls the war of all against all. When every man for himself is happening, everyone's fighting each other. And so someone comes and steals something from your house or your wherever you live, your hut, you have the responsibility to fight them physically. He's saying that's the state of nature. Everyone's fighting. And so you need you need a leviathan. You need, in order for you to be more efficient, you should outsource that to a what Thomas Hobbes calls a sovereign, someone who legitimately uses violence in order to stop others from using violence. And so this entering into this relationship with the Leviathan, which he calls the sovereign, which the Leviathan, that is what they call the social contract. So this is Thomas Hobbes. Now, and which is a lot of what we base all of our legitimacy within law and reasoning about what government or state has, the duties it has over you. We get a lot of it from Thomas Hobbes. But then you have Jacques Rousseau, which he pushed back and said, well, within the social contract, you also have examples of people that live without a sovereign. And he points to the Caribbean and says, and he has this concept, which probably didn't age well, the name, but he called it the noble savage, and said, look at this group over here. They are operating without any Leviathan, and they're not in a state of war of all against all. So you don't need a Leviathan. So they were pushing back and forth. Now, the author pushes back on that and says, now we have archaeological evidence and anthropological evidence. Rousseau and Hobbes were good at the time. They did their best, but they didn't have evidence. So now we should revisit. So that's the whole idea of it being a false choice. He says, there's a bunch of claims here. Agriculture was not a single revolution, the agricultural revolution. So this is talking about, we were foragers, we were hunter-gatherers, and then we moved into the agricultural revolution. We became farmers. And it all happened at once, or what have you. And he says, no, it was slow, it was uneven, and it was reversible. People went back and forth. One of the examples he uses is the Amazonian cultures. So we'll talk about that. Cities imply states is a mistake. What does he mean by that? You can have a city, and then his definition of state includes some form of violence. It doesn't imply you have a state. It doesn't imply you have a king who can deploy violence on you. He gives examples of cities. One of them is an ancient city in Mexico. We could talk about that later. Now, domination has components that can separate and recombine. We'll get into that, but there's definitely some counterintuitive notions in there. And then freedom is practical. He defines freedom as the ability to move or exit, the ability to disobey orders, which I find to be very counterintuitive, and then the ability to create new relations, new social arrangements. So these are the major premises of the book. Now we have our 4 counterintuitive truths that we're lifting out of the book. Truth number 1, pre-agriculture, right? So remember, foraging and hunter-gathering is before farming. Doesn't really make much argument there. But they were saying that life was not just tiny egalitarian bands, people roaming around. Truth number 2, agriculture and cities did not automatically create hierarchy. Number 3, the state is not only one thing. It has components when you're reasoning about what the idea of a state is. And then number 4, human freedom is practical. And what he is saying is human freedom is that ability to leave or exit, the ability to disobey orders, and the ability to reconfigure social relations. And he's saying that actually was historically common. Now let's get into truth number 1. Foragers were not just tiny egalitarian band. And when we say egalitarian, we're talking about people that were equal, that looked at themselves as equal. And so there weren't an elite. There wasn't an elite. So pre-farming societies were politically diverse. They experimented. Many oscillated seasonally. They had different rules in different seasons. What example? This is the Amazonian societies. So they would have a foraging setup in one season where they're going and, the fruit is ripe, they're picking it, that type of thing. And they were egalitarian. And then they would go in the off season and they would become hunter-gatherers, and then it would become hierarchical. And so they would go, but when they would go back to the other season, then they would switch back. So you had people going back and forth purposefully, voluntarily going back and forth. Then also you can have foragers and hunter-gatherers. This is before farmers in agriculture. You have them building large projects without permanent rulers. So an example of this is I think it's called Poverty Point, but it's something point in Louisiana. And we're talking 1100 BC. There's 400 acres of development, architecture, statues, all types of stone sculptures, these types of things happening there a long time ago. And they had no evidence. This is archaeological arguments. There's no evidence of them having any permanent rulers. And so archaeologists and anthropologists look and see how people were buried. They have all these sophisticated ways of saying it. Do you have an elite? And they said there wasn't any, but there was a massive project that happened before agriculture, before farming, which is counter to the normal claims. So the past looks like a carnival of experiments of different political forms, hierarchies, non-hierarchies, and other things. We're going to talk about domination, but it wasn't a ladder, it wasn't a progression.
Right. So, I mean, I guess after this first point here, the thing that I'm saying is, like, if we know that societies had oscillated seasonally with different rules and even different leadership structures in the summer versus the winter, this proves that hierarchy is not the default. It's a choice, right? And of course, if we have hierarchies that are in place, they are going to reinforce things because people higher in the hierarchy want to remain in power. They want to be a ruler. It shows that large-scale coordination, building monuments, managing resources can happen without permanent coercive rulers. So we should look at these blueprints and build on them.
Exactly. So now we have a diagram here. On the left side, it's what people normally think. And it's your intuition or what you were taught. You have roving bands of hunter-gatherers. We've heard the phrase hunter-gatherer before, or maybe foragers. And then you have tribes that get together, and you think of maybe, they're getting together to defend themselves against one another. And you'd have the strong leader of the tribe that's the best fighter, and he protects the rest of everyone else, or something like that. And you have chiefdoms, and you have states. Some loose intuition of this, and the author says this is a myth. Now on the right, it's saying what's more true or more accurate is there are experiments. There are seasonal forms, like what we just talked about, Amazonian societies as an example. Many political arrangements, hierarchies, not hierarchies, seasonal, back and forth. No single default path. We'll talk about this, but the pathway to domination, the pathway to a state, the author also has a problem with that. So people will say, you went from this charismatic leader, possibly, to, we have to, maybe it's bureaucracy. And then we needed a king, so sovereign, so people deploying violence. Or it could go, the author's saying it can go violence, charisma, and bureaucracy. Or it can go bureaucracy first, and then charisma, then violence. Either one of those pathways, he's saying, are valid, and there are examples of them. So history is experimentation. Now, truth number 2, agriculture and cities don't require kings. I think this is the most counterintuitive and would receive the most pushback just from talking with people. It's saying that you had cities without kings. You watch Game of Thrones, you think it must be that you have something magnificent, there had to be kings. A large project, there had to be a king.
Yeah.
It had to be a
heads must have been getting removed.
Yes. So agriculture didn't begin private property everywhere. So people that were farmers didn't necessarily adopt a concept of private property. So that by itself is, a revelation. Early farming communities could be low rank. What does he mean by low rank? Meaning that they didn't have a political elite or a permanent elite. So why is this controversial? When you think of farming communities, some of this is controversial. But when you think of farming communities, sometimes you might think of, you have one farmer and then their family. But also, you could also think of slavery. And so when you think of that, then you say, there was a hierarchy. And yes, a farming community, there's hierarchies, people had slaves, yes. And then you may have heard that all societies had slavery. And so the author is very big on saying that is false. And it's definitely false about chattel slavery, and gives an example of the Native Americans in the United States. there was maybe in the Northwest, they had some form of slavery, a group that was up there, and it wasn't chattel slavery, but they had, but everywhere else they didn't have it, and they lasted thousands, millennia with no slavery. And that's one example is of a group of whole societies. If you wanted to look at all the United States as one society, that's false also. But even if you were to do that, you could say there were millennia, multiple millennia of no slavery. And they were agriculture, they were foragers, they were all kinds of stuff. So early farming communities, many cities, so they also built cities. And they didn't have hierarchy as well. So first off, the early farming communities could be low rank, which arguing that they could have no hierarchy, including slaves, whatever it is that you want to look at as hierarchy. There's examples, many of that being false, as far as the idea that there was a hierarchy there. Number two, so that's controversial. Number two, many early cities were robustly egalitarian. What could you possibly mean by this? How could it be a city and then everybody's the same? There has to be a king or whatever. And he gives one example of a city in Mexico before the Spaniards came. And they moved towards having a hierarchy and fought it off and lived in a decentralized fashion, egalitarian. But it's a city with large structures and everyone living together and all this stuff like that. So then there's archaeological evidence of that. So that's a counterexample. There's other examples of cities in other books or whatever. We're talking about just the archaeological evidence here. And then you have the idea of the city becoming, or a city implies a state. So if you're a city, you must be a state. And we're saying, no, that's an assumption. You have cities that were states. You have this concept of city-state. But it's not a law. There are cities that were not states. And so when you try to define what a city is, you could affirm the consequent. You could say anything that is a state and it's this many people that live together, that's a city. You could do that, but there's pushback. It's like, are you going to call these cities states? They didn't have a sovereign. So that's truth number two.
Yeah. So, I mean, when we're building software, I mean, we can look at it kind of as building a digital city, right? Or a large scale community. This is probably the most hopeful news imaginable to hear that you do not have leaders. You don't have to have leaders. You can have complexity without capture. I mean, because we have seen agriculture didn't automatically create private property, and cities didn't automatically create states. And also, you did not have to exploit labor for agriculture and have rulers or hierarchies there. Yeah. So we can really start reframing the way that we think about things and the way that we've been programmed. I know that it is hard because, you know, when we're in social circles, it's kind of like an echo chamber. Right? One person says one thing and it's like, oh, that sounds about right. The next person is going to hear it and they're going to be like, oh, I agree. So we all have come to this consensus, but that's not the way that it has to be.
Right. The phrase political imagination and the limiting effects when you don't have examples, it's definitely what he's getting at. So on this slide, we have cities don't equal states. On the left, like we said, cities, the idea is there's the cities, there's a bureaucracy, there's kings, and then you have a state. And on the right side, the cities can be egalitarian coalitions. You could have federations. What is a federation? Groups that voluntarily enter into an agreement with each other that they can leave. We'll talk about freedom later. And then plural institutions. We have some concept of that when we think of our executive branch and the legislative branch of the United States. But the idea of you have competing checks and balances, these are plural institutions, people designing those and entering into those. There's examples, cities of doing that without hierarchies. And they could have one is a hierarchy and another institution is not. And they check each other. So there's examples of this all throughout. So truth number 3, the state is component, not a thing. What do we mean by that? Domination has building blocks. It's not one origin point. What do we mean by domination? We'll talk about it some more on the next slide. Power can crystallize into different principles. Again, we'll talk about it on the next slide. But reasoning about power, breaking it down into three, he's going to break it down into 3 primitives. Then you can have a way of categorizing what the authors are saying are the actual ways that power evolved. Early states often fused only 2 of the principles. We're going to talk about 3, but they often fused only 2, and they could combine them. Modern states are going to fuse all 3, and these are the 3: sovereignty, and this, the author's view is going to take a Hobbesian way of referring to sovereignty as who can deploy legitimate violence. Then you have bureaucracy, so the author would say is more recording, especially debt, recording of who does what. And he also calls that information. And then politics, in this sense, you can call it charisma.
Okay. So with this, I do want to recap because I think that this is extremely important. So this is the system thinking insight of the book. So if we look, domination isn't one monolithic thing. It's a stack of components. So you have sovereignty, the monopoly on violence, administration. You have the control of knowledge, and heroic politics, the control of charisma. So early states often had 2 of these 3. Now, with that being said, the modern state is so powerful because it fuses all 3 of them. For builders, this is a diagnostic tool. When you analyze a system, ask which of these 3 components is being concentrated and where is the choke point. So when we're building, we're keeping this in mind. We're knowing that these 3 pillars do exist and we can actively work against them.
100%. So let's get into this diagram, the domination triad. You have violence, and it implies sovereignty. This is kind of odd to reason about it this way, but the idea is that you have violence, but you have legitimate violence. What's considered legitimate violence? Someone protecting themselves, someone protecting another, the police coming protecting you. This is the state exercising legitimate violence. But one interesting thing within this idea of scale, like how many humans can you deal with? The author, Graeber, he says that violence is not very scalable. Why? He gives an example. A king's power is about how far he can throw a spear. And so beyond that, he needs the other 2 components here. So in order to scale, there has to be either some type of knowledge, some type of bureaucracy, some type of setting up of a recording, so it can extend outside the room the king's in. And he can then start to deploy threats of violence outside of his physical. You also have charisma. You can look at this as reputation, shaming, some type of thing there, where the king or the hero or what have you, they have the ability, because of their charisma, to have power outside of their immediate vicinity. So these are the 3 components the author has, and the modern states will do all 3 because they want the charisma with the legitimacy, and of course the recording, and we're entering into more of a surveillance state. And then of course they're going to deploy violence. So people concentrate on, when they think state, they say the monopoly on violence. And then the author is saying, well, it's really a domination. Violence is actually not scalable. You need the other 2. This is where, and then he also says this is how states evolved. One, you could have just two of these, and it can get you very far as creating a state. Uh, but they don't come in an order. Is one of his big points he really harps on. You could have violence first, you could have knowledge first, and you could have charisma 1st.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the order in which they deploy it, it's really all strategic.
Yep. So now number 3, the concept of freedom in the author's context. He uses it freedom in the sense of it a practical usefulness. And he's saying that historically freedom was assumed in his definition of what freedom was. So what is it? Freedom to move, freedom to, this is exiting. We like that word. Relocating, being received somewhere else. This was assumed historically. People could leave. Sometimes you may not think this. Someone can't. If you had tribes, you can't leave the tribe. You're going to be killed. Actually, no. People had the freedom to leave. Often times. But this second one is very counterintuitive. Freedom to disobey. Freedom to refuse orders without punishment. Why would someone give an order if they couldn't punish someone with the order? So it's extremely counterintuitive, but it's real. You had a group in Canada called the Wendat, and the chieftains there could give orders, and everyone had the ability to disobey the orders. They could decide, I don't want to do that, and there wasn't a punishment. They could decide if they wanted to receive the punishment, these types of things. But what's more interesting and controversial is when the Westerners met up with this group, the Wendat, they had debates. And the Wendat said, you all in the West, you all are slaves. You all have a top-down set of rules that you have to obey. Otherwise, you get violence deployed on you. And so when you're coming to us saying, we should adopt what you're doing, they were, to my understanding, they were bringing some of them over to France to debate and saying, you all are the ones that are primitive. So this is interesting. View. Freedom, then in the next one, the freedom to create new social relations, new social arrangements, reconfiguring the institutions. And we're going to talk about it on the slide, but if you don't have the freedom to move and the freedom to disobey, then you're not going to be able to reason about and have a public debate about how you should arrange your social life. So when you don't have these, what happens? What do you lose? We stop believing things are possible. We lose our political imagination. You will believe that hierarchy is destiny, and you'll create things where you have hierarchy built in. That will be what you reach for because you can't imagine something else. So that's why the book is important to see that there are other things, at the minimum, other things were possible. But even the stronger argument is very often that history was not in the sense of hierarchy, more and more hierarchical layers being applied to each other.
Yeah. So, to recap, because this is the ultimate takeaway that I got from the book, freedom isn't an abstract idea. It's a set of practical assumed abilities: the freedom to move, exit, the freedom to disobey, which is to refuse, and the freedom to create a new social relation is to reconfigure. When we look at these, there are a lot of things that mirror our reality now, right? We can take into account, we'll say citizens of the United States. We'll just use that as an example. If you don't have the money, the ability to travel, right? That is your inability to move, to relocate, to really get around, right? We can look at the freedom to disobey as being censored on social platforms, right? That is another angle that you can look at that. And we can look at really the creating of new social relations. Our ability, well, us being censored on social platforms and not having the ability to move, these are all top down issues that we would be suffering from. So I kind of wanted to bring those back to more realistic examples of how these could affect us. I mean, and how they are affecting us today, just to put some insight into it. But finally, at the end of all of that, we do lose the imagination to even think of creating something new, because we have been set inside of confound like the confines of walls for so very long. So we just stop believing that anything other than that is possible.
Yes. So let's dig into that again. When you have the, and how these are related to each other, you have a loss of movement when it's harder to leave. That's also going to affect your ability to disobey because you're trapped. Now, the next one, though, the ability to disobey really makes it to where you lose your creative freedom as far as social arrangements. If you can't disobey the what the rules that are put in front of you, it really is going to, when you do a proposal, for instance, if someone can't disobey the proposal, you can't really even put a proposal, right? Everything that is a proposal, if you're a king, you put a proposal, it's law. So but it affects your creative freedom. And I'll talk about this again in the next slide. But when you're designing, we could say modern digital communities, we're thinking about how are we going to restore these three things. Now, this is the portion where we critique the book, and we're trying to bring it into our different ways of viewing building or designing digital communities for builders. So for this portion, this is about craftsmanship. And so applying craftsmanship, software craftsmanship, to the ability to reconfigure what the author is saying reconfiguring. So now we're lifting concepts from two places: the structured interpretation of computer programming, which is the author's name is Sussman, and then Christopher Alexander's timeless way of building and a pattern language. So he's an architect. So on the structured interpretation of computer programming, the idea within both of these is you're trying to create a language and solve a problem inside of the language. Why? There's top down designing architecture, which is what people normally think of when they think of architecture. And then there's bottom up. And there's an argument that most of architecture is bottom up. The but so what we're trying to do is, instead of having a top down development, we're trying to facilitate and push out a language for people to reason about any of these books. So within this book, there are three ways, sorry, not three ways, but three components of building a language that was within the structural interpretation of computer programs. So you have primitives, composition, and abstraction. I'm going to talk about all three. So remember, we're applying this to this book, and we're going to try to lift that for builders. So primitives, what are the primitives of the book? You have moving, exiting, you have disobeying, and you have reconfiguring, creating new relations. Okay. Those basic fundamental pieces, you have the ability to compose them. So composition, there are rules. You can think of this as grammar, how you can compose within the English language different primitives. The same thing here when you're creating a language. Movement protects refusal. Refusal makes redesign credible. Let's say refusal makes redesign credible. What do we mean there? If you have the ability to refuse, like I was saying earlier in the previous slide, if you have the ability to refuse some rules, when someone makes a proposal, if you adopt what's in the proposal, it makes it better. It makes it more legitimate. It makes it more credible. If you're forced to do what's in the proposal, it's not really a proposal. So composing the two, you have a new outcome. You have something that emerges from it, which is credibility. Now, abstraction is the workhorse. You can also look at it as maybe meta composition. And we have this concept of domination. What is this? That what the author was talking about, where you're composing violence and information and charisma. You're needing some way. Domination is a generalization, a way to reason about that when you're looking at, of course, he was saying different states. You can have states that are violence plus information or what have you. The generalization again is the domination, the abstraction. And so you have all of these ways of facilitating a language, creating patterns that you can see, and then you're trying to build a digital community using these, hopefully. And then, so when you're building these, when you're using this to build, you'll come up with these patterns. This will be a living language. And so you have to have this back and forth. Maybe you write a book about it. Maybe you put it on GitHub or what have you. But it needs to be shared, testable, and auditable. There isn't a top-down way to do this language building and solving of your problems in the language.
So to hop in, I what this book really reveals is, I mean, I have a few points here. That the first is that the inevitability of hierarchy narrative is political fiction, and it is not an empirical fact. It makes alternatives feel naive and reform feel pointless. Humans have always experimented with social forms. We've just been taught to forget that. The second point that I got here was that the domination triad comprised of sovereignty, administration, and heroic politics is a stack of components that can be diagnosed and dismantled. And this triad also serves as a useful diagnostic tool for builders, which we can keep in mind. It allows you to identify which component is being concentrated in any system that you're building or analyzing. And the book puts it very nicely. The three practical freedoms, which are the freedom to move, the freedom to disobey, and the freedom to reconfigure. This is serving as the direct antidote to the domination triad. And the last thing is that the most powerful prison is the belief that reconfiguration is impossible. All right. So what should we build? Can we put the slides up here? Let's see.
Up.
Let's go on here. On our display, though. Let's see. The slides. They're not showing up. Are we having technical difficulties? All right, there we go. Yeah. All right. So what should we build? Systems where exit is easy. Portable identifiers, open data, interoperable protocols. We should build systems where forking is possible, with open source governance, allowing permissionless innovation. Systems where users can create their own rules, having customizable governance, or there is a modular architecture in which there is selectivity by the user. Diagnostic tools that expose which domination components are being concentrated so that you can have full visibility into what is going on into the application and where those where the of the three for the domination triad, where things are really compiling. And carnivals of experimentation. There should be a space to try new social forms without permission, without being hammered and saying no, you can't do that. So with that, if we are building an identity system, and with these, I'm going to give all some technical, some examples of technology that are price compliant and before I go into that, price is the framework that we've established for no pre-mine, no roadmap, no issuer, and no censorship. So if we are building identity systems, we want to avoid lock-ins and platform-owned identities. And we want to adopt more self-sovereign, portable identities. Examples of that would be, for identity systems, there are Lightning authorizations. The identity is derived from a Bitcoin key pair. There's no issuer, there's no lock-in. In contrast to open authorizations or single sign-ons, which you would have, maybe through Google, or you could have, some sites even do Microsoft, because they are platform owned, they are sensible, and they censorable, and they are exit dependent upon the issuer. Second, if we're building a governance mechanism, we want to avoid concentrated sovereignty. Oh my goodness, my eyes. Administration and politics, those are the domination triad. And we want to adopt distributed sovereignty and transparent administration. Again, full visibility into everything that is going on. And before I give these examples for governance mechanisms, I do want to preface this by saying most on-chain governance tools fail the price test. And this is because validators can censor transactions and smart contracts have the ability to blacklist addresses, right? So the domination triads, administration, sovereignty components are exactly where those tools concentrate power. So we choose not to use them. The motto should be rules without rulers. So excellent examples of that would be Bitcoin improvement proposal, the Bitcoin improvement proposal process, which allows for a rough consensus, running code. There's no issuer, there's no censorability, and it's forkable. Lightning bolts, which is a technology that sits at a level 2. It has the exact same model as the Bitcoin improvement proposal process, and it keeps things decentralized, right? So for community platforms, we want to avoid rigid hierarchies and the non-ability to fork, and we want to adopt modular rules, easy forking, and user-defined governance. So solid examples for a community platform would be Nostr, right? There is no issuer, there's no token. It is relay level censorship is exitable. You can just run your own relay or switch relays. In contrast to just about any other platform out there, when we're looking at, it could be Discord, Slack, Instagram, Facebook, all of that. They're platform owned, censorable, and there is no exit path. You can't just take your social graph to another application. And if we are building a protocol, we want to avoid single choke points, no exit paths, and we want to adopt, multiple implementations and easy migration. So if we're looking here, solid protocols for that example again would be Bitcoin. There is no issuer, no censorability, and Lightning networks, and also Tors, right? There's onion routing, multiple impulse, and there is no issuer. So we got that here. And as far as exit and choke points, it's just really keeping all of these things in mind when we're creating the architecture for our software, and we get to build it.
All right. If you're watching this and paying attention, you're being spoiled right now. There's a lot of work that has gone into trying to reason about the choke points. Builder usability, make political imagination usable. So now this is kind of a pushback towards against the book in some ways. So the Don problem, you have obviously, what the author is proposing, hierarchy wins when it's the only usable default. So we have that reduction of political imagination. What you want to do, and the concept here, what we're trying to propose here is that we're trying to get people, we have a problem. We want people to be more decentralized. We want people to resist domination, and we want to have people reason about institutions with freedom. In order to get people to do that, you have to make it, if you're building something, building software that's going to facilitate digital communities, for instance, you're going to have to build things that are very usable and help build other builders. There's people who are customers, but you're building things for other builders as well. You're going to the chasm of a what is the bringing them. How are you going to do it? If you just go ahead and put every throw, people won't get adopted. That's what they're about now. There's some successful ways that things have been built that we can draw and that we're trying to put forward here. Conventions. This is the idea of having same defaults. Convention over configuration. What are we trying to do when we're saying within the primitives and nomenclature of this book and some of the concepts within this book? Moving, refusing, and reconfiguring. We want to make it that easy. That's going to be the sane default. That's going to be the normal path. You don't need to be an expert if you build something that facilitates this. You shouldn't have to be an expert in order to make those three things happen. We want to have it to where those are the same default. The omakase view. So you ship one clear default again for trying alternatives before the endless options. These go together. But this is the idea of harvesting. So first, there's the idea of building libraries and so on and so forth, where you have same defaults. Then there's the idea of the whole framework. You want to make it to where you harvest from a real example, and this goes on also into the next idea, next concept. You're harvesting the framework and saying, okay, we have one real example, and you're making it, we're going to have same defaults tuned for that example, and then you're going to make it to where you don't say endless options for all communities and all cultures. No, you start out with one, and then you expand and you make the regular thing easy, and then you make the very hard thing possible, is a good rule of thumb. You have your integrated systems first. Again, when you are designing something, you're designing this framework, this digital community media, let's say, you want to have the identity, data, and rules and appeals. All of that stuff has to work together. Again, for one community. And then if you want to have integration with other frameworks, other software and all that, that's when you'll move later into making it. Or if you're developing something to where it's going to be, you can think of it as federated, multi-tenancy is another fancy word, but making it to where you have the ability for communities to deal with each other, that's second. First, you have to make it work for one. And that would be, again, you want to have it be turnkey. You want to have the capability, the sharp knives and big tent. You want to have the capability for the users, the dabblers, people that are getting in. They have the power to change this framework. They have the ability to experiment with it. And you want to make it big tent so everyone can get in, easy to contribute. Now, questions to contemplate. What story of inevitability do you believe? Where is your political imagination reduced? That probably sounds kind of harsh, but how is it?
Absolutely does.
Yes, is it reduced? I think I'm reduced here. But where could you expand your political imagination? Where do you see the domination triad today? Violence, information, bureaucracy, charisma. Which freedom is most fragile today? Moving, disobeying, and reconfiguring. What would it look like to restore one of these freedoms locally? And then we have our conclusion. We want to treat institutions like it's not destiny, right? Hierarchy is not destiny. We want to ask, where is the violence? Where is the bureaucracy, the recording? Where is the charisma? Where are all of these being concentrated? We want to ask, can people exit, refuse, and reorganize without permission from some elite ruling class? And we have a
Mhm.
hopeful claim: the past contains many alternatives to hierarchy being destiny.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that I find that question kind of hilarious. Where is the violence? But all right. So leading out here, I'm gonna have my one model here. We got the one model, one story, and one action. The one model is this: institutions are designs, not destiny. They're combinations of domination components, and they can be taken apart and recombined. The one story is the freedom collapse cascade. It's the story of how we lost our three practical freedoms one by one, and how that loss made us forget our own true powers. And the one action for everyone listening, tailored to what you're here for. If you're looking for an exit path from feeling powerless, your action is to run a freedom audit on your own life. Ask the three questions: how easy is it for me to move my identity, my money, my social graph to a new platform? What happens if I disobey the terms of service or the social norms of my community? Do I have the tools to reconfigure my social relations, or am I stuck in a rigid hierarchy? Your goal is to find one area where you can restore one of these three freedoms, even in a small way. If you're here to build the tools for this new world, this new exciting world that we're going into, your action is to use the Domination Triad as your design brief. When you build a protocol, a community, or an app, ask: am I concentrating sovereignty, administration, or politics? Or am I distributing it? So build tools that restore these three freedoms, build systems where the exit is easy, you have the freedom to move, where forking is possible, you have the freedom to disobey, and where users can create their own rules. Uh, they have the freedom to reconfigure. So that is how you build a system that is not just decentralized, but truly free.
All right. And if you have any comments, be sure to leave them in the comment section. And don't forget to visit bitlemmas.com, where we have past episodes and other information. And we'll see you next time.
See you next week.